favorite things to do is to start talks off with like a quote or something. This one is by the wonderful writer and farmer Wendell Berry. The soil is the great connector of our lives, the source and destination of all. It is the healer and restorer and resurrector by which disease passes into health, age into youth, death into life. Without proper care for it, we can have no community, because without proper care for it, we can have no life. All right, so why am I talking about soil? I got a lot of flack for trying to talk about soil science in a compost training, but I felt like it was important because compost is applied to soil. And so it helps to understand what's going on and what the benefit is for why we want to use compost and make compost. So this first section is kind of going to go over an overview of soil as an ecosystem and the different processes behind it, the different kind of services, ecosystem services that it provides. And you know, composting is kind of a waste management strategy, but as we mentioned in the first section, it's very integrative and holistic, and so that waste management process is enhanced through soil health. So we'll be covering an overview of soil ecosystem services, a look at some of the compost benefits to soil. We already talked a little bit about that, and diving a little bit deeper into soil structure and function, as well as soil biology and biochemistry, more about the structure and water dynamics and how that works out, decomposition, ecology, and some of the microbiology and biochemistry involved with that process, and a little bit about carbon sequestration as well as humus formation. There's some differing opinions about what humus is and how it should be defined, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about that. So this is a nice chart of different soil ecosystem services. Soil is able to provide a lot of different things, such as water purification, kind of watershed regulation, flood regulation as well, bioremediation and reduction of soil contaminants, climate regulation, atmospheric regulation, nutrient cycling, habitat for organisms, providing all of our food, fiber, and fuel, carbon sequestration, and also like soil is land, so it's a source of cultural heritage sites. History is kind of written in the soil. And so there's a lot to kind of honor and remember about different sites around our world. Provides construction materials, especially for like natural earth building. We utilize the soil itself as a building material. It's also a foundation for construction and development. It's also a source of pharmaceuticals and genetic information. There's so much microbial diversity in the soil. Many of them produce antibiotics, antifungals, beneficial compounds that medicines can be extracted from. And they're always evolving new strategies and new compounds. So they're a really great resource to kind of pull that new information from. So this is another kind of synopsis of the soil ecosystem services. I think the major kind of different points here are erosion mitigation, food. I think these are more related to the work that we're doing. So erosion mitigation, food production, habitat restoration, and decomposition. What is soil? It's not just a handful of dust or a handful of minerals, but it is a quarter air and a quarter water, and about 1 to 10% organic matter, which consists of like plant roots, decaying plant and animal matter, as well as the microbiology and macrobiology of the soil. And it's about a little less than half is the mineral content, so a lot of it is mineral content, but the biology is also an important part of it. And even though the organic matter content is only like up to about 10% of the soil, it provides many of the critical ecosystem services that we want from our soil, like nutrient cycling, carbon sequestration, erosion mitigation. So even though it's a small slice of the pie, it plays a critical and major role in all of the functions of the soil. So this is kind of a look at what soil organic matter consists of and a little bit about how it's kind of made. So we have our plant roots, plant residues and animal residues going into a funnel, which is called in this diagram a microbial filter. So our microbial life is decomposing and transforming all of these organic materials into stable organic matter. And we'll be distinguishing between active organic matter, which is easily turned over and recycled, and then more stable organic matter, which is more resistant to degradation and supports long-term carbon sequestration. We are harnessing both like a few different processes, the biology, the chemistry, and the physical structure as a whole ecological process. And when we take a snapshot of each of these situations, we get a snapshot of the ecosystem as a whole. But they all influence each other. For example, we take a snapshot of the biology, we can make inferences about what the chemistry might be like, what the physical structure might be like. If we take a snapshot of the chemistry, it can tell us about some of the biological and physical processes that are happening. So they're all interrelated, and all of them are involved in nutrient cycling, organic matter formation, all of those ecosystem services. So just briefly about soil formation as a process. Technically, the definition of soil formation is the weathering of rocks. So you have your bedrock material that's underneath the soil layer, and there's a weathering process that happens, whether it's through the microbial ecology or through climate or through some other, like over geological time, that rocks break down through like precipitation, heat, drying, things like that. That the rock is broken down into soil. And so that's kind of characterized by these different factors of climate, topography, organisms over time. Those are all the factors that influence the weathering process of the soil. So we start with kind of pure rock, and as it gets exposed to weather and biology, it begins to break down, and we call it weathering, and starts to build up an organic matter layer. And over time, as that process continues, you start to develop distinct soil horizons, we call it. So if you dig down deep, 20, 30 feet into the soil, you'll create like a soil profile, and you'll be able to see distinct layers through that profile. And that tells you about a little bit of like the color and the texture and things like that. Will tell you a little bit about the mineralogy and composition and some of the biological processes that are going on in there. And so you have more of the organic layer at the top, and then the particle sizes and rock sizes get bigger as you go down, and eventually you hit your bedrock, which is your parent material. Soil formation is a process. It's also part of classification. So there's many different classification systems. There's a standard in the US. Other countries have their own standards. There's also international standards that are classified based on how the horizons form, their color and water properties and things like that. And that's a whole school of learning in itself. So we won't worry much about that. Soil erosion, as we talked about, is a major issue influenced by wind and water taking away soil, and tillage makes soil more vulnerable to erosion. The more vegetative cover you have, the less likely you are to have soil erosion. So things like overgrazing, when you have too many animals grazing all the plants, that makes the soil susceptible to erosion as well. And basically what we're trying to restore balance to is to reduce the soil erosion rate and increase the soil formation rate. So we have more soil formation than we do soil loss. So that should be like the goal that we're trying to pursue in terms of soil health and land management practices. One of the most basic kind of principles of like soil and soil classification is soil texture. And basically, soil is categorized into kind of 3 particle sizes. So our largest particle size is called sand. That's 0.05 to 2 millimeters. And then our intermediate size particle, these are like the mineral particles, and they refer to the size of the particle, is silt, which is 0.002 to 0.05 millimeters. And then our smallest particle is clay, which is less than 0.002 millimeters. And the different percentages of clay, silt, and sand are classified as different soil textures. Kind of the ideal texture for agricultural soils is a loam, which is a pretty even balance of all 3 particle sizes. And that affects porosity. So when you have all these different particle sizes come together, you have all different pore spaces that form. So you have tiny pores, medium-sized pores, large pores, and that's kind of where the action happens. That's where water and air are collecting. That's where our microhabitats for microorganisms occur. It's room for plant roots to grow as well. These are sites of kind of dynamic activity of like nutrient exchange in the soil. So this is kind of what these pores can look like. They can be filled with air, they can be filled with water, they can have microorganisms living in them or roots growing through them. So that's important to kind of maintain like a good pore space distribution for all of those things to happen. I'm going to get into a quick demonstration of a soil jar texture test. So that's going to be right here. First, I'm going to just kind of talk you through the process, and then I'm going to pull out a jar and just do a really simple demonstration. So there's laboratory methods to assess soil texture, and this affects things like water infiltration and drainage as well. So it helps to know your soil texture. So there's a method of like going into the field and wetting the soil and like making a ribbon out of it, and then based on the texture of that, you can classify it as like, you know, loam, sandy loam, clay loam, etc. And then in the laboratory, they do like a sieve analysis. They have specific sized like sieves that they screen the material through. And so they get, and then they quantify the percentages of those particle sizes based on that. Here, we're going to do a little jar test. This is really simple. So you just need a jar, the soil, and you fill the jar about a third with soil that's like filtered through a sieve, so you filter out some of the large particles. Then you fill the jar with water, leaving some room at the top. Add about a tablespoon of dishwashing soap, and then you shake it vigorously, and then you'll kind of get your texture estimate after about 2 days. The sand settles really quickly, so the sand layer settles after about a minute. Then the silt layer settles after about 2 hours, and then the clay after about 2 days or 48 hours. And then you can take a ruler. I've got a handy little ruler here, and you can measure the height of each layer and get a percentage of the total height. And then there's a tool called the soil texture triangle, where you can input those percentages and get the texture name, which is kind of based on feel and kind of characteristics of the soil. So the way that the texture triangle works is you have your percent clay on this left side going up the triangle, and wherever your clay reading is, let's say it's 60%, you go across parallel to the bottom. And then you get your percent silt, maybe like 20%. And that goes down this way, parallel to the left side. And then you get your percent silt. So we're at like 80%, so like 20% silt. And that goes up this side, parallel to the right side. And because the clay content was high in my example, it's a clay soil. So this is clay, I guess, has a kind of a dominating feature. So that's why like so much of this triangle is clay. So if you have like more balanced silt and sand content, then you can get to some of these other textural classes. But that's kind of basically how the soil texture triangle works. And you guys can play around with this when you have a chance. You can kind of see this sand layer here. The silt layer is maybe a little bit of a different color. And then the clay layer is usually pretty thin at the very top. And so you can measure the texture of those groups. So I have some examples here. This is a native soil from the Buena Vista Community Garden. Let's see, I have my more precise percentages here. But it's basically a loam, which is also what the laboratory test told us was the texture. But this has about 0.75 inches of sand, which is about 50%. And then the silt layer is about 0.5 inches, which is 33%. The clay layer is about 0.25 inches, which is 17%. So that fits in with the loam classification there. I also prepared a kind of a pure sand jar. It's just like sand from Home Depot. So I wanted to see how that would settle. It does have a little bit of a silt layer. Then I mixed sand and clay. And the clay is like screened from the Buena Vista native soil, so it's like even finer. So you can see kind of distinct layering there, and then kind of a pure clay. And this one is from Zorthian Garden, and it's like a native plant garden. It's kind of a loamy sand texture. So I'm going to pull out a jar and just do a quick demonstration of how to set this up. Okay, so Prima is helping me demonstrate right now, and we've got a sieve, a funnel, and a jar, and we're scooping some of this kind of crappy vacant lot soil into this jar here. And we only need to fill about a third of it. So once we get about a third in the jar, then we can add some water.
We need that much of space on the jar, right?
Yeah. So we've filled it with water up to here. And then if you want to grab the tablespoon and drop a tablespoon of the dishwasher soap in here.
Spoon, right?
Yeah. Yeah, then you can put the lid on and give it a good shake until it's uniform, kind of slurry. So if it's all mixed up, that's good. And then we can just let it sit. You'll probably start to see the sand layer settle pretty quickly. It'll settle in a minute. And then we'll start to see the silt layer later. And so we'll come back to this in 2 days to see if we can analyze the texture. And you guys can try it out. And see who's got a better texture analysis. So this is an estimate of your, want to do something simple in the field to get an estimate of your soil texture if you're coming into a new space. That might be something of interest to do to see what kind of soil you're dealing with and figure out, what kind of amendments you might need to suit the type of gardening that you're doing. Porosity is kind of a laboratory measure of pore space in the soil, and soil texture affects porosity, infiltration rate, drainage, so the way when water goes all the way through and recharges groundwater. Also the available water capacity, which is basically like the total amount of water that the soil can hold as like a sponge. So this is just kind of showing more about the relationship between texture and plant available water. So you can see that So the permanent wilting point is like the lowest amount of water the soil can have, where the plant can't take it up anymore. So it's going to wilt. Like there's still a little bit of water in the soil, but the plant can't take it up, so it's going to wilt. Field capacity is like the kind of total amount of water that the soil can hold without going into kind of saturation. So if you put more water in, then it will like drain out afterwards. So in between those is the plant available water. And so our textural classes of like sandy loam to like clay loam have the most plant available water. So that's the kind of range that we want for like food production, gardening, all of that. Natural ecosystems, like the forest ecosystem, has a greater infiltration rate than conservation agriculture, which is the green square. And then the blue square is the natural grass vegetation, like a prairie. So those are all higher than the conventional tillage, which is the red triangle at the bottom. So this is another look at infiltration rate and soil type. So our kind of natural ecosystems like forests have much faster and higher infiltrates than kind of the cultivated agricultural lands. And this is another kind of example of that, where kind of forested ecosystems have much higher infiltration than our cropped ecosystems. So just want to kind of encourage kind of the practice of agroecology and kind of mimicking natural ecosystems in our agricultural production systems. You know, enhancing biodiversity, both above ground and below ground, will help our water conservation efforts as well. Soil aggregates, I've talked about before, are biological organisms, secrete glues and enzymes that stick those particles together and improve all of our soil and water properties. I feel like I'm repeating myself here, but just want to be clear about how important healthy soil aggregates are. So they're great for water infiltration, root growth, erosion and resistance, and basically all organic matter improves aggregate stability. So any kind of mulch, hay, compost, manure that you can add to your soil is going to help. So a poorly aggregated soil is not going to allow water to infiltrate as well, and it's more prone to erosion. And so well aggregated soil is going to promote plant root growth and water infiltration retention. That supports healthy plant growth, which is what we want. And they also provide an optimal environment for soil microbes, so we really want to take care of those guys because they're doing so much of the work for us. So pore space and aggregation are things that really help our microorganisms establish healthy habitats. So this is a look at our soil food web and all the organisms that are in there. Our bacteria and fungi are our primary decomposers, and they're feeding on fresh organic matter. Protozoa are kind of multicellular organisms like amoeba, protozoa, things like that, and they're feeding on bacteria and fungi. And they're excreting plant-available nutrients like nitrogen. And nematodes, too, are like invisible worms that feed on bacteria and fungi and protozoa. And they also produce, as a waste, like plant-available nutrients. So these kind of secondary trophic level organisms are very involved in the nutrient cycling process. So it's the metabolic activity of the microbial ecology that's providing a lot of the plant available nutrients, beneficial enzymes, and growth promoting hormones and things like that. And beyond that, we have microarthropods, which are small kind of invisible insects, and then we have regular macro level insects. And then we have our small mammals on top of that. So this is another look at kind of the different soil organisms that inhabit our soil ecology. The fungi are like the connectors. They form networks and help to exchange resources and nutrients and water from across distances. Bacteria are our decomposers, one of the primary decomposers. protozoa known as grazers. The mycorrhizal fungi are a specific group of fungi that kind of infect plant roots and are able to build networks throughout the soil and exchange nutrients with other plants. So they're very powerful. So it's really great to encourage their growth in the soil. Also, they really specialize in like phosphorus and nitrogen. So if you use a lot of phosphorus fertilizer, that can disrupt the arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi growth, because the plant is like, oh, there's so much phosphorus here, I'll just like take it from the soil solution, and I don't need to ask the mycorrhizae to give it to me. So in some ways, like limiting the nutrient input can help to encourage mycorrhizae, because the plants will be like, hey, I need help, there's not enough nutrients around, can you like get me some nutrients from over there? Glomalin is a cool enzyme that's produced by these mycorrhizal fungi, and they coat and protect the hyphae, which are the strands of the fungi. And they also support aggregate stability and soil structure. They enhance carbon sequestration. Fungi are more efficient at sequestering carbon than bacteria because they're more likely to incorporate it into their bodies, whereas bacteria will respire that carbon as CO2. So a lot of that was related to soil water dynamics, and so we're going to do a little soil water infiltration demonstration that Gina is going to help me with. This is kind of demonstrating runoff versus infiltration. So we have our soil sample in this plastic bottle. There's holes at the bottom. So this black tube is going to kind of mimic runoff from the soil. And the water that's going through the bottom is going to be captured here as the infiltration. And so the first demonstration we're going to do is with some native soil from Buena Vista Garden. And then it's the same soil with a layer of mulch on top. And so Gina's going to pour the water in, and then we're going to see how much goes into runoff and how much goes into infiltration for each. All right. We have liftoff. You can go faster if you want. The runoff water is going into this jar. And then the water that is getting infiltrated into the soil and recharging groundwater is going into this jar. Okay, so you can see that there's runoff in both of them. And this one has a bunch of soil particles in it. It is dark brown in color. And this one has no soil particles or very little in it, is very clear water. And so the mulch has pretty much completely prevented erosion from happening here. And
wow!
Also there's less leaching. So the water here is clear too, so it's more filtration happening. And there's just a lot more soil movement happening in this situation. So that's the power of mulch. So don't leave your soil bare. It makes it prone to erosion. Put organic matter on it. It'll help to prevent erosion. Okay. So the next test we're going to do is with that same native soil, and this is with we did a bunch of amendments on top. So we have a couple inches of mulch, manure, Amy's Farm compost, and our own compost on top. So it's kind of a composty soil. So yeah, we have to move these funnels over. No. No, there's just holes under the plastic bottle. Yeah. So that's it.
Okay.
All right. Are you ready?
Yeah.
Go.
You can see that the water is pooling at the top on the native soil, and it has like already been soaked up by this composty soil and kind of mostly gone through into the infiltration section. There's a teeny bit of runoff in here, not really over here. Well, Gina did such a great job pouring, there was no runoff.
That's what I was gonna do.
All right, let's make some runoff. But you can definitely see the water pooling and taking its time going through over here. We're going to overflow the system now.
It's still not.
Yeah, that one's going to overflow at the bottom.
Uh-oh.
Oh, because of the jar.
It's okay, as long as there's no electronics around. All right, still getting more runoff over here. Still pooling up here. There's still water in this bucket here. And like most of the water has kind of gone through on the composty soil. So yeah, power of compost to turn your soil into a water sponge.
That was cool. That was really cool.
So I'm going to talk about cation exchange capacity and kind of nutrient exchange. The thing about nutrient exchange is that plants absorb them in their ionic form, and that's why people thought synthetic fertilizers were a good idea, because like that's how plants actually take up the nutrients on a biochemical level. But it kind of bypasses the holistic ecological perspective. But that is true that plants absorb nutrients in their ionic form. So like nitrate, NO3 minus, ammonium, NH4 plus, etc. And the holistic ecological perspective is that it's the metabolic activity of the soil food web that releases plant available nutrients in their ionic form. And it is the organic matter that facilitates the generation of plant nutrients by activating the soil biology. Okay, so this is just a big table of like the macronutrients and micronutrients that plants need as essential nutrients, kind of looking at their ionic forms and their chemical signals. So there are a lot of anion or cations. There's also some anions, which is more facilitated through the soil metabolic activity as opposed to the cation exchange capacity. So the cation exchange capacity is basically like the plant root is shedding like hydrogen ions, which are H plus ions, and the clay particles and organic matter particles are negatively charged, so they're kind of bonding to the positively charged ions. And it's like a loose association. It's like a loose connection. And so when the plant root wants like a calcium, which is like a 2 plus charge, it'll kick off like 2 hydrogens. And then the 2 hydrogens displace the calcium that's bonded to like the clay or the organic matter particle. And then the calcium floats into the root hair. And it's kind of how the ionic exchange happens. So the total number of cations the soil can hold is its cation exchange capacity, and there's a way that they assess that in the laboratory. So it's essentially a measure of the soil's ability to store plant available nutrients. So the higher your CEC, the greater your plant nutrient storage. Stable organic matter, like what we might call humus, has more binding sites for cations than clay, and it can hold and release 2 to 4 times more cations than clay. So the higher the CEC, the more cations can be supplied to plant roots, the more nutrients are available. So it's kind of how it works. So this is a look at the clay structure. It's generally in these like crystalline kind of sheets. I think there are ways to like fluff it up, and that's kind of a more, I think it has to do, is related to calcium. But typically they're in these platelet kind of forms, and they have negative charges on the outside. So that's where your cations can kind of loosely connect to the clay particles. Comic that's kind of fun that tries to kind of explain the CEC in a fun way. So Clay is kind of cool because it's such a small particle size, so it's greater surface area to volume ratio, and then it stays suspended in the water solution for a long time. So you can have greater activity around the clay particle in like the water solution, and it has that second box on the top has that sheet structure with negative charges. So it's a site of like dynamic activity in the soil, and all those anions kind of hang out in like clouds around those clay particles. So more about the structure of clay, and then humus is different. Like organic matter is kind of these round coiled chains of carbon, hydrogen, but it's also like kind of other components involved too. But it's like stabilized organic matter. It's more like round, kind of clumpy shaped, essentially. And so it's a little bit different that way from the clay, but there's kind of oxygens all around. And so oxygen tends to be in solution negatively charged. And so that's kind of the place of exchange in connection with the anions or cations. So this is like kind of a fun comic that kind of showcases like how these differently charged cations kind of compete with each other to bind to the clay or get into the root hairs. So it's like, you know, if you have a calcium, which is 2+, and then there's like an H+, then it can replace like a, I think aluminum is 3+. So there's like a balance of the charges situation that's happening with the nutrient exchange. And this is just a review of kind of the nitrogen cycle, where kind of plant litter and animal manures are feeding the microbiology, which is generating ammonium and going through like nitrification to create nitrate, and then denitrification to create atmospheric nitrogen, and nitrogen fixing bacteria in legumes help to pull nitrogen from the atmosphere into the soil and contribute to that process.